The last Chinese dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, came to power in 1644. Early on in its rule, the dynasty had an isolationist policy with no trade for security reasons. This gradually opened up as the Europeans began making more frequent visits to the Far East. As trade increased with the Europeans, the Qing Dynasty found themselves facing a serious problem. Massive amounts of opium entered the country from the Europeans in exchange for Chinese goods such as tea and silk. The Qing Dynasty was concerned with the adverse effects of drug use within its borders. They tried to combat this by implementing trade restrictions. Unfortunately for the Qing Dynasty, the technologically superior British found trade restrictions unacceptable. This resulted in 2 opium wars, the results of which forced China to remain open to European trade. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Qing Dynasty lost significant power during European occupation. This led to civil war with the competing states within China. The Japanese Empire invaded much of China in the prelude to World War II, putting a temporary pause on the Civil War as Chinese factions united to combat the Japanese. Once the Americans expelled the Japanese at the end of the war, the Chinese Civil War resumed. By 1949, the Chinese Communist Party had secured power over most of China, with the losing government fleeing to Taiwan, and the port cities of Macau and Hong Kong remaining with their European rulers. Following their ascension to power, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP for short, implemented communist and Marxist reforms. Peasants were encouraged to overthrow and kill their landlords, suppress counter-revolutionaries, and consolidate power and combat thoughts and opinions that differed from party leadership. The CCP instituted a series of 5-year economic plans based off the Soviet model started in the 1920s. These 5-year plans were initially aimed at reconstructing the Chinese economy and society into a communist model. This was the purpose of land redistribution movements and economic ventures centered around state-owned enterprise. To oversimplify it, the short version of these reforms resulted in somewhere between 15 and 50 million Chinese deaths, depending on whose statistics you use. From the end of World War II to the death of Mao Zedong, the Communist Party had implemented these drastic campaigns to reshape society into an agricultural utopia and educate the masses on the moral goods of communism. This aggressive enforcement of communism may have peaked between 1966 and 1976 with the Cultural Revolution, in which all non-communist elements of Chinese society were purged. Vast amounts of Chinese art, history, and cultural artifacts were destroyed. Chinese youth were sent to the countryside to learn from the peasants and engage in the agricultural utopia Mao was focused on creating. This resulted in a lost generation in which millions of Chinese youth were denied the opportunity to pursue technical education. By 1976, China's economy and society were in shambles. In September of that year, Mao Zedong passed away, leaving behind a complex legacy. China was now independent from its former European and Japanese oppressors, and had greater military capacity to defend itself. But this came at the cost of a great deal of intellectual and cultural purging and economic degradation. The Communist Party recognized that changes needed to be made. For reasons I will explain in another video, Chinese-Soviet relations had been deteriorating since the early 1960s. The United States saw this as an opportunity to warm up to China. With Mao Zedong no longer in power, communist leadership saw a relationship with the Western world as an opportunity to reverse economic decline and reinvent their economy. With greater access to global resources, foreign investment, and trade opportunities, China began opening its economy to the outside world by opening special economic zones along the coast. These special economic zones were designed to attract foreign investment and technology with the goal of increasing Chinese employment and support capital formation. Their plan was to produce products and services that would be exported to global markets. The first 4 of these economic zones were selected due to their close proximities to Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, making them geographically close to foreign capital. These 4 economic zones proved to be successful in just a few short years, and the number of special economic zones expanded along the Chinese coast and inland along the navigable Yangtze River. Each of these zones generated infrastructure projects to develop modern ports in each zone to support their export-driven economics. China had chosen an export-oriented strategy to take advantage of the vast natural resources that were available in China. As foreign capital flowed in, China was able to develop itself into a low-cost manufacturing hub, accelerating economic growth and further integrating itself into the global economy. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that the Chinese development model was working. 3 economic clusters were formed along the Yangtze River Delta, the Pearl River Delta, and the Min River Delta. These clusters were able to take advantage of economies of scale, and they developed into industrial districts. China's GDP nearly tripled from 1978 to 1992 with the development of these special economic zones, but a new problem began to arise. The Communist Party's stated purpose was to improve prosperity and economic equality for all, but the vast majority of economic growth was isolated to these economic zones where there was free trade and more foreign capital. Thus began the largest internal migration in human history as the Chinese Communist Party focused on moving rural populations to urban areas. This serves 2 purposes. In a modern economy, the percentage of workers needed in the agricultural sector is typically less than 5%, and China was hovering around 60%. The economic solution to this was to try to modernize agricultural practices and relocate as many people as possible to urban areas. In the early 90s, the one-child policy had only been in place for a little over a decade, so there was a bulge of young, cheap labor that could be moved to more productive areas. From the early 90s to the mid-2010s, this worked like a math equation for the Chinese economy. The CCP knew that increasing population density and urbanization would increase GDP by a proportional percentage. This GDP growth was further increased by extensive infrastructure projects and urban development that is characteristic of China today. The massive migration of more than 300 million people to urban areas cemented China's grip on global manufacturing. China had become the fastest developing economy and largest manufacturer on the globe. After multiple decades of rapid growth, China has now entered a period in which they have to adapt in order to keep up the pace. Despite what many people think, China is not actually a wealthy country. It has the 2nd highest GDP in the world, but this is largely due to its size. It has a population of roughly 4 times the United States and total GDP of about 70% of the size of the US. But when measuring GDP per capita, China sits around $10,000 per person, putting it in the 79th place on the global stage. This puts it behind such countries as Iraq, Iran, Panama, and Belarus. While China's meteoric rise has been impressive to watch, its economy is far from its ceiling. However, from the mid-2010s to the present time, several factors have arisen to impede the rates of economic growth China has become accustomed to. This sort of economic growth China underwent has happened before, just not on the same scale. In the 1800s, Germany industrialized at a rapid pace, as did Russia in the early 1900s. Japan and South Korea also saw rapid growth in the 20th century. This is the norm when pre-industrialized or primitive economies modernize. For a mixed command economy like China's, it is especially rapid as resources can be allocated and decisions can be made quickly and with a singular focus. The easiest way to explain how economies evolve is by explaining the economic sectors model introduced by Alan Fisher, Colin Clark, and John Foresti. There are 4 sectors that describe the economic phases countries go through. The primary phase is focused on agriculture and resource extraction. This is the most primitive type of economy in which there are very few middle-class or upper-class citizens. The secondary phase involves transforming raw materials into manufactured goods, such as textiles, chemical production, or automobile production. These economies add value to given resources through labor and require some level of education or training for workers to participate in economic activity. The middle class starts to expand as manufacturing grows. The tertiary sector is focused on providing services. Trained professionals like lawyers, doctors, accountants, and engineers are each specialized in their fields and present solutions to personal and business needs. Entertainment and hospitality services start to emerge, and upper middle class society emerges along with a larger upper class. The quaternary sector is based on information technology and research and development. Information gathering, data analysis, and product design provide high-income jobs. As an economy becomes more developed and more advanced, greater levels of education are needed. As an economy moves from primary to secondary to tertiary to quaternary, less labor is needed in more primitive sectors of the economy. For example, as an economy develops, it needs fewer farmers and more computer programmers. Assuming abundant resource availability, it is easy for a country to move from primary activities such as farming to secondary activities such as manufacturing. China is currently stuck between the secondary and tertiary sectors with a small sliver in the quaternary sector. China is exerting a lot of effort to develop a more advanced economy with a greater focus on information technology, biotechnology, and services. To move from a manufacturing economy to a service economy requires time, resources, and education. While China has abundant resources, it lacks time and the education. China is no longer as low cost as it once was as a manufacturing hub. Due to demographic changes, China is running out of young people to throw into manufacturing jobs. While it has spent the last 4 decades moving hundreds of millions of people from rural areas into urban areas, it has done so with the one-child policy in effect from 1980 to 2016. This means that China is quickly aging and is experiencing a massive labor shortage. While it can still move people from the country to the city, the median age is over 38 years old now as compared to 21 and a half years old in 1975. China's 3 economic clusters located on the Pearl River Delta, Min River Delta, and the Yangtze River Delta have served as important centers for modernization. The vast infrastructure projects and real estate development projects fueled by the fastest urbanization ever seen in human history. This has played a large role in economic development. With the population of China set to decline in the coming decades, there is much less demand for infrastructure development. With rapid urbanization driving a lot of growth since the 1980s, it is not surprising to see a reluctance of Chinese economic planners to give up infrastructure projects. This is one of the reasons ghost cities are not an uncommon occurrence in modern China. Another problem facing China is its export-driven economic model. China needs to export the manufactured goods that it produces because there are not enough people to consume them at home. This is complicated by the fact that the traditional export destinations for Chinese goods also have aging populations. As populations age into retirement, demand for manufactured goods decreases. Western Europe, Canada, Japan, and Korea are all aging rapidly. To compound the problem, the US and China have had a series of trade disputes over the last couple years, limiting the number of goods China can sell to the US. China invested heavily in Africa with the hopes that it would be able to sell more of its manufactured goods to the African continent. However, the African continent has not developed as much as many economists thought it would over the first part of the 21st century. Aside from diminishing exports, China needs vast amounts of capital to develop the high-tech economy that China is aiming for, and the question is whether or not China will be able to obtain this capital. China has a large cohort of engineers and scientists working diligently to further develop the economy, but with a diminishing domestic working population, shrinking global demand for manufactured products, and an overextended real estate market, there are a lot of hurdles for the country to overcome. For economies that have undergone rapid development like China, initial growth has been relatively easy to obtain. Pouring capital into infrastructure projects will always generate a flurry of economic growth as construction workers, engineers, technicians, etc. are provided with employment. Resource extraction and transportation also experience growth as resources are required for expansion, thus giving work to miners, truck drivers, and safety inspectors. The problem is that this can become an addiction for a growing economy. China is still trying to expand its urban footprint and thus capitalize on infrastructure projects, but these keep coming with diminishing returns. A simple example to illustrate this is to imagine the Chinese economy like a farm. The CCP, or the farmer, wants to expand his farm and hires a bunch of workers to plant all kinds of crops. He pays one to plant corn, another soybeans, another rice, and another wheat. During the season, the farmer has gone into debt to employ extra labor with the hopes that he will be able to profit off of these crops. This generates a lot of economic activity for the 4 workers that were hired and now have income that they can spend on goods or services that they need. At the end of the planting season, when it's time to harvest, the farmer learns that his fields are unsuitable for soybean and rice crops. The money that he threw into soy and rice is lost as he receives no yield from his investment. In a developing economy, the farmer can expand his wheat and corn production until market demand is met. Once the farmer reaches a steady state where supply and demand are in balance, he now wants to expand his farm once again. Without the introduction of new technology or change in demand, a farmer that is focused on profit will continue planting wheat and corn and reaping the benefits. A farmer that is focused on generating economic activity will once again plant soybean and rice crops and can further increase his corn and wheat corn production. This requires more workers who are paid and generate the economic activity that worker is looking for, but the farmer is losing money. The farmer can try to find more productive techniques to farming or may develop new technology that either assists with productivity or creates a way that rice and soybeans can be grown effectively. Teaching new techniques to the laborers and developing new technology requires capital, which the farmer has already spent on unproductive labor. If this cycle repeats itself over and over, the farmer ends up in a financial hole. This is an oversimplification, of course, but is the sort of state that the Chinese economy is in. It has maximized its manufacturing capacity with the focus of maximizing employment. It now needs to find a new way to either produce more labor or move into more advanced activities. Even if China's financial woes were magically fixed, China is still paying the price for poor levels of education that have existed since Maoist reforms in the 60s and 70s. There is still a labor shortage due to a shrinking young population, and there are still limited export opportunities due to global aging. China's attempts to combat economic weakness have included corporate espionage to steal tech secrets from Western companies and universities, an abolishment of the one-child policy and reports of the CCP considering forced fertility, and foreign infrastructure projects in Africa and other parts of Asia. The global regions that could support Chinese exports moving forward are North America, South America, Africa, and India. North America does not trust China and will never completely open its doors to Chinese exports. The U.S. will severely limit what economic ties can be made with South America due to the America's Monroe Doctrine philosophy. Any hopes of economic ties with India will be severely limited due to military tensions. And Africa has not had sufficient infrastructure development and lacks a middle class that could afford Chinese products in bulk. These are some of the main factors China will have to contend with in the coming years. China's financial and demographic situation is at high risk of hindering economic growth moving forward. China does have a considerable group of intelligent scientists and engineers to build out the tertiary and quaternary sectors of the economy, but China certainly has its work cut out. Some things to expect out of the Chinese economy moving forward. The CCP knows that its finance structure needs to be adjusted, but this will cause major disruptions and could wipe out the wealth of hundreds of millions of Chinese, resulting in further instability. Immigration could improve the labor shortage, but China is anti-immigrant. If you pay attention to Chinese propaganda, it's very clear that China is for the Han ethnicity and no one else. Just look at the way they treat the Tibetans and Uyghur Muslims. China would need to bring in tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of immigrants, and even if they were pro-immigration, the only place that could supply that kind of workforce would be India and Southeast Asia, which do not trust the Chinese. The economy itself needs to be restructured to diversify from manufacturing and construction, but high-skilled labor takes time to educate, and there are limited numbers of people with the brain power to serve as engineers and scientists in any population. There are tens of millions of workers in manufacturing and construction, but they have nowhere else to go. China can start adjusting its demographics through forced fertilization. They implemented the one-child policy. It would not be out of the question to think that they would enforce a 3-child or even a 4-child policy in the future, but it takes 20 years for a newborn to enter the workforce. so this plan would not pay off for another generation. And the last and potentially most terrifying possibility is enforced euthanization. Euthanasia has been increasing in popularity in the developed world as the number of retirees is soaring. With such a top-heavy population dominated by the elderly, it remains to be seen how euthanasia will play a role moving forward. One thing is certain, even if euthanasia does not increase, there will not be enough government funds to take care of so many elderly people. China's go-to strategy over the last century has been social engineering. As depressing as it is to consider, it's fairly likely that we'll see some extremely disturbing social engineering programs focused on reshaping the demographic structure to one that is more manageable.